Between August and November 1888, the streets of Whitechapel were darkened by a string of brutal murders, the killer later being nicknamed Jack the Ripper. Today we are diving into the notorious killer who terrorised Victorian London. Let's immerse ourselves into the murders of Jack the Ripper. As the world's largest city at the time, London in the 1800s was a crowded, poor place with disgusting living conditions. Many immigrants and refugees travelled to London and swelled the population of the East End. And by 1888, Whitechapel alone had 80,000 inhabitants. Because of the overpopulation, the richest individuals could be living just a street away from the poorest in the city, though the upper class mainly lived in the West End, with the poorest congregating in the East. Author George W.M. Reynolds wrote in 1844 that the most unbounded wealth is the neighbour of the most hideous poverty. The crumbs which fall from the tables of the rich would appear delicious viands to starving millions, and yet these millions obtain them not. Child mortality was extremely high and was mainly caused by the air they breathed, the water they drank, and the hideous living conditions. Over half of the children born in the East End died before they were 5 years old. The lower class also had very few options when it came to improving their life. If they did complain about the living conditions, their landlords would evict them, giving way to a life on the streets or the inhumane conditions of the local workhouse. Many women had no other option than to work the streets just to live to the next day. And this wasn't the worst part of living in Victorian London. Infectious diseases were the biggest cause of mortality, and epidemics of tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus and influenza were common, killing thousands of people. Most of these diseases were well known to the inhabitants of London, but in 1831 Britain suffered its very first epidemic of cholera. Only over time it was understood that the disease was spread by sewage contaminated water. This is just not a very forgiving place to live, even without the murders. Though there were great advances in medicine at this time, this had very little impact on life expectancy because most diseases remained incurable. The only good news is that if you did make it to adulthood, you had a good chance of making it into your older years. But life expectancy was very, very low at birth. In 1850, the life expectancy was 40 for men and 42 for women, and even by 1900 it was 45 for men and 50 for women. So undoubtedly there were improvements that were made in the later 1800s, but all in all, Victorian London was a very dangerous place to live. Though Jack the Ripper has only been associated with killing the 5 canonical women we will cover in a second, there were many other murders that took place at the same time. These very well could have been committed by the same person, but as the murder style is a little bit different to the Whitechapel murders, it's not really been associated with the work of the Ripper. Now let's get into the canonical 5. On a wet, gloomy August night, Constable John Neal was patrolling Bucks Row. As he approached the stable yard, he noticed the body of a woman lying on her back, and upon closer inspection by the light of his lamp, he saw that the woman's throat had been cut. Constable Neal spotted a fellow policeman passing at the end of the street and used his lamp to signal for assistance. Constable Thane swiftly joined him. Unbeknownst to Constable Neal, as he instigated a series of official procedures, were the events that were unfolding in Baker's Row, a few hundred yards away. 2 men named Charles Cross and Robert Paul were already informing another police officer about the body. 5 minutes before Constable Neal got there, Charles Cross, a cart driver in the East End, had discovered the body before being joined by fellow cart driver Robert Paul. To preserve her dignity, the 2 men pulled her skirt down to cover her lower body and proceeded to go and find an officer. Soon after, a doctor arrived at the scene and examined the body, confirming that she was indeed dead. He mentioned that she had died only half an hour prior to being found and that she was killed on the spot. It's more than likely that Mary had been working the streets when she met her death, as later it was revealed that she'd been turned away from her residence for not having 4 pence to pay for her bed. A witness reported her saying, "I'll soon get my DOS money, see what a jolly bonnet I've got now." She then left the lodging house, likely with the intention of working the streets to earn that 4 pence. The post-mortem revealed several injuries, including 2 deep cuts to the throat, both of which had penetrated down to the spine. The first cut was 4 inches long and the second 8 inches, stretching from ear to ear and severing the large artery. Her downstairs area had been stabbed twice and a deep gash started from the abdomen up to the sternum, exposing the intestines. Despite this, no internal organs had been removed, and due to the incisions, it was concluded that the murderer had rough anatomical knowledge. This murky evening marked the start of a chain of events that would change the East End of London forever and focus the world's attention on this part of the capital. In the early hours of the 8th of September, John Davis, one of the 17 residents of 29 Hanbury Street, walked out into his back garden and to his horror found a mutilated body laying on the stone steps. The woman's throat had been cut twice, all the way around the neck to the spine. There was also an opening in the abdomen from which the intestines had been removed and placed over her shoulder. An autopsy revealed that the uterus and a portion of the bladder had also been removed. The woman was identified as 47-year-old Annie Chapman. Annie was known to sell crocheted flowers to make a living, and when she had no other choice, she would also work the streets. Less than 30 minutes before her body was found, a woman claimed to have seen Annie at the front of number 29 with a man who asked her, "Will you?" to which she replied, "Yes." 10 minutes later, Albert Kadosh, the next door neighbour, was out in his garden when he heard noises from next door. A woman's voice whispered no, and a thump was heard. Kadosh was used to hearing number 29 at all hours, so didn't really think much of it. 20 minutes later, the body was found. With dramatic reporting in the press now taking hold, the East End experienced public hysteria. As a result, there was a substantial demand on the police as they struggled to apprehend the killer and keep control of Whitechapel. At this point in time, multiple suspects were brought in for questioning, but none of them could be charged due to the lack of evidence. A few weeks later, a letter was released supposedly written by the murderer. This would inevitably spark further outrage in London. The Dear Boss letter was addressed to the Central News Agency of London and was dated the 25th of September 1888. It was received by the Central News Agency on the 27th of September and then given to Scotland Yard on the 29th. It was written in red ink, was 2 pages long, and contained several spelling and punctuation errors. Its purpose seems to have been an effort to mock the investigators in their hunt and to hint about future murders. The letter read, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I'm down on and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with it, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. At midnight on the 30th of September, Constable William Smith saw Elizabeth Stride with a man at 40 Berners Street, who was carrying a long package. Having no reason to feel suspicious, Smith continued in the direction of Commercial Road. At 1:45, dock worker James Brown saw a woman he believed to be Stride standing with her back against a wall at the corner of Berners Street, speaking with a man in a long black coat. Brown heard Stride say, "No, not tonight, some other night." As dawn broke, the streets of the East End became crowded by police officers. The Whitechapel murderer had struck in the early hours and this time had taken 2 lives. One of these victims had been murdered in the City of London, and therefore the City of London police force was now involved in the hunt too. At 1 a.m, Louis Dimeschutz, a club steward, found the body of Elizabeth Stride in a dark walkway off of Berners Street. He had turned into the gates of Dutfield's yard and his pony suddenly became anxious. Jumping down to see what had startled it, Schutz found the body. The murderer had cut her throat like the other victims, but hadn't performed his usual mutilations on the rest of the body. It is therefore believed that Schutz interrupted the killer. Whilst a crowd congregated at Dupfield's yard, the murderer was at the very same time still out on the streets looking for another victim. After being released from the station for being drunk on the street, Catherine Eddowes made her way in the general direction of Aldgate. She was last seen alive at 1:35 a.m. by Joseph Lowend when she was standing in a narrow walkway talking with a man with a fair moustache near Mitre Square. She was facing the man with one hand on his chest in a welcoming manner. At 1:45, Constable Watkins turned into Mitre Square and noticed a bundle lying on the ground. Upon inspection, Watkins was dismayed by the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes. If the Whitechapel murderer had been denied the satisfaction of mutilating the body of Elizabeth Stride, his thirst for blood had been more than quenched in Mitre Square. The face and the lower abdomen of this victim had been mutilated in what can only be called a frenzy. It's often said that all the victims of Jack the Ripper were prostitutes, though several of those who knew Catherine Eddowes insisted that she was not. Elizabeth Stride, however, was known to be a prostitute, but also made money from cleaning houses and sewing. When incorporating the Dear Boss letter in Eddowes' murder, investigators noted that a section of the auricle and earlobe of her right ear had been severed, giving credence to the author's promise that he would clip the lady's ears off. Even more convincingly, the letter wasn't made public until the very next day, on the 1st of October. It could be argued that it was the aftermath of this double event that the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. It was a name that turned a series of morbid East End murders into an international spectacle and gave the perpetrator an immortality that has lasted to this day. At 1:45 on the 8th of November, a woman saw Mary Jane Kelly, slightly drunk, going into her room with a blotchy-faced man who was carrying a pot of beer, as you do. Once in her room, Kelly began to sing for quite some time. At 2 o'clock that morning, George Hutchinson, who knew Kelly, saw her on Commercial Street. She asked him for money, but as he had none to give, she bid him farewell and carried on her way. She was then approached by an unusually well-dressed man by the entrance of Thrill Street, who put his hand on her shoulder before the pair burst out laughing. Hutchinson claimed that he was suspicious of this man because, although Kelly seemed to know him, the way he was dressed made him suspicious in that neighbourhood. The man also made a conscious effort to hide his features from Hutchinson by pulling his hat over his eyes as the two passed him. Hutchinson followed the couple and watched as they went into Mary's room in Miller's Court. He waited outside for 45 minutes, but as he saw no one leave, he headed off. At 4 a.m, 2 residents of Miller's Court heard the cry of murder, but they would ignore this as it was a common occurrence in Miller's Court. Later that morning, landlord John McCarthy sent his assistant Thomas Boyer to collect Mary's outstanding rent. Boyer knocked on Mary's door, but receiving no reply, he proceeded to look through the windows. Noticing the broken pane of glass, he put his hand inside to pull aside the curtain and upon peering into the room, saw the body of Mary Jane Kelly lying on the bed, ripped and hacked to pieces. After 2 official crime scene photographs had been taken, Kelly's body was taken from Miller's Court to the mortuary in Shoreditch, where her body was formally identified by the ear and the eyes. A part of the post-mortem stated that the whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all round, down to the bone. The viscera were found in various parts, viz. the uterus and kidneys, with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on a table. The pericardium was opened below and the heart absent. This murder was unique in that it was the most gruesome of them all, but also because this was the only crime scene where photographs were taken. The photos that survive to this day are a testament to the sheer carnage that doctors and the police faced that day. News of the murder spread quickly and the public outrage disrupted the Lord Mayor's show, which was taking place in London at the same time. At the funeral, there was a colossal amount of grief shown by the public, with huge crowds lining the procession route through the East End. Kelly was the youngest Ripper victim at just 25 years old. The horrific nature of this murder is probably why many assume Mary Jane Kelly was the last victim, as people believe that the Ripper had finally quenched his thirst for violence. Although, as the weeks, months and years passed, the Ripper remained uncaught and there was a continuous threat of another murder happening just around the corner. During the course of their investigations, the police regarded several men as strong suspects, though none of them were formally charged. The prime suspect of being Jack the Ripper was Aaron Mordecai Kosminski, a Polish Jew who likely arrived in London around 1880 to 88 when he was a teenager. Not much is known about Kosminski's life in London. His later medical records state that he was a barber and hairdresser, but it was also stated that he hadn't worked for years. It's been suggested that this was due to his deteriorating physical and mental health. Kosminski would be admitted to a workhouse on 2 occasions due to having a mental break, and was later admitted to a lunatic asylum in 1891. 2 of the most senior officers of the Metropolitan Police who were tasked to solve the Whitechapel murders named Kosminski as their prime suspect. Sir Melville Macnaughton was chief constable in the 1890s, and although he wasn't an officer when the murders were taking place, he had full access to the evidence and the investigations that continued in Whitechapel for several years after the murders. In 1894, Macnaughton wrote a confidential memo for the Metropolitan Police files. The memo contained 3 prime suspects, one of them being Kosminski. Kosminski, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel, this man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. The man in charge of the investigation into the Whitechapel murders in 1888 was Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. In 1910, after retiring, he received a signed copy of the memoirs of Sir Robert Anderson. Anderson had been Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at the time of the murders. Swanson had made numerous notes in the margins, adding further details and context. These included the name Kosminski next to a passage where Anderson asserts the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitantly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him. This witness was Joseph Lewend, the one who saw Catherine Eddowes with a man 10 minutes before her murder. Lewend ultimately refused to testify because both men were Jewish and he didn't want to provide evidence that would condemn the other man to death. Isn't it crazy though that if Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, how close it got to him actually being named? It just makes you wonder if he was willing to actually testify against him. Would it have been solved back then? A shocking discovery of evidence became apparent in 2014 when amateur investigator Russell Edwards bought a shawl at auction and commissioned DNA analysis on it. The shawl was claimed to have been found next to the body of Catherine Eddowes. Edwards published a book naming Jack the Ripper, which states that stains on the shawl had proven to be blood and seminal fluid. Mitochondrial DNA, so passed down from the female genetic line, had been matched with Catherine Eddowes' known descendants, and the seminal fluid had been confidently matched to a descendant of Kosminski. Although several aspects of this analysis were criticised at the time, Edwards restated them in a book in 2024, which again stated definitively that Kosminski was the murderer. This, paired with the positive identification in the 1890s, seems like tangible evidence to suggest that Kosminski may have been Jack the Ripper. Though it is important to note that the shawl was not mentioned in the list of items at the crime scene. So is this due to the disorganisation of the investigators by not writing this down, or was it just not there? I will let you ponder that for yourself. John Druitt was a Dorset-born barrister who also worked as an assistant schoolmaster at a boarding school from 1881 until November 1888, when he was suddenly dismissed. His body was found floating in the Thames on New Year's Eve in 1888. Stones in his pockets had ensured that his body stayed at the bed of the Thames for several weeks, and the jury returned a verdict of whilst of unsound mind. His likely took place at the end of November 1888, 3 weeks after the last Jack the Ripper murder on the 9th of November. Interestingly, McNaughton stated that Druitt disappeared during the Mary Jane Kelly murder, and that his own family believed him to have been the murderer. But on the 1st of September, the day after the first murder, Druitt was in Dorset playing cricket. Most experts believe the killer was local to Whitechapel, whereas Druitt lived miles away in Kent. He was therefore dismissed as a serious suspect, as the only evidence against him was the coincidental timing of his death. James Maybrick was a Liverpudlian cotton merchant and arrived in London in 1880. Nothing about his life aroused any suspicions at the time until his death. He was poisoned by arsenic in 1889, and his wife Florence was charged with the murder. In 1992, a journal was released to the public that was most likely written by Maybrick. The author claims in the diary that he'd seen his wife, whom he calls the bitch or the with her unnamed lover. The rage he experienced during this event sent him on a murderous rampage in Whitechapel, where he mutilated and killed 5 prostitutes. The journal contains a lengthy description of the murders, before ending with, "I give my name that all know of me, so history do tell what love can do to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." There has been scepticism around the authenticity of the letter, given that the person who made it public, Michael Barrett, confessed to forging the diary and then retracted his confession. His wife would then claim that the diary had been in her family's possession since the Second World War. This is just a little bit messy for me to treat him as a real suspect. The descriptions of the crimes in the diary are also taken from press reports, and it repeats some inaccuracies of the murders. He reports that Mary Jane Kelly's body parts were strewn around the room, when in reality they were actually confined to the bed and on the bedside table. And he claims that her breasts were placed on the bedside table when they were found underneath her body. There is, however, another piece of evidence that links Maybrick to the crimes. In 1993, Albert Johnson purchased an antique gold watch, and on the inside he found scratched the initials of Jack the Ripper's 5 victims, the signature of J. Maybrick, and the words, "I am Jack." Scientific analysis points to the scratches being compatible with the period of 1888 to 89, but the sudden appearance of the watch a year after the diary was made public aroused a few suspicions, to say the least. It is possible they were both created at the time, but to prove Maybrick's guilt, their authenticity needs to be proven beyond a doubt, and this just hasn't happened. I assume this is due to their age, but I'm not quite sure. Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, was second in line to the British throne. Even though he had a grand future to look forward to, things quickly went south for the prince. He'd had a stagnant military career, held an apathetic personality, and was rumoured to be a homosexual. As a result, he was seen as a disappointment to the royal family. The theory that Prince Albert was Jack the Ripper is mainly based on the findings of the prince's physician, Sir William Gole, about the prince's health and mental condition. The theory states that the prince contracted syphilis in the West Indies, and the fatal disease impacted his mental health, causing him to become insane. It was this insanity that compelled him to become Jack the Ripper and murder multiple women. The theory suggests that the royal family were fully aware of the prince's deteriorating mental health and his secret identity, but chose to do nothing. No attempts were made to restrain the prince until after the double murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. That is so interesting if that is true, because that would be quite a coincidence. As the syphilis worsened, the prince's mental state continued to deteriorate until he was confined to an asylum where he spent the rest of his days. Despite these claims, there is no concrete evidence to support this. It's also confirmed that Prince Albert wasn't in London for most of the murders. Another theory suggested that one of the Ripper victims was pregnant with Prince Albert's child, and in order to silence her and protect the integrity of the prince and the crown, the concept of Jack the Ripper was dreamt up. The mother was supposedly murdered alongside all the other women who knew the prince's little secret. If you've seen the film From Hell, you'll be quite familiar with this theory. Once again though, no solid evidence to support this theory has ever come to light. Jack the Ripper quickly became the children's boogeyman at the time of the murders and after, being depicted as a monster, which is what he was. In the 1920s and the 1930s, he was depicted in a film dressed in everyday clothes as a man with a secret, preying on unsuspecting victims. By the 1960s, he represented the upper-class exploitation of a predatory aristocracy, being portrayed as a gentleman wearing a top hat. And this is the kind of visual cue I get when I think of Jack the Ripper, and I think this is the one that has lasted to this day. The gruesome nature of the Ripper murders and the poverty of the victims did draw attention to the living conditions in the East End, and people became disgusted over letting the poorest in society living in squalor. In the 20 years following the murders, the worst of the slums were demolished, but the streets and some buildings still survive. These places provide a constant reminder to residents and visitors to the East End of its dark and twisted past. I really hope you enjoyed this video and you found out something new about the Ripper case. I'm fairly confident that Jack the Ripper is my favourite mystery of all time, due to the nature of the murders, but also the ongoing cluelessness of us not knowing who he was. If I had to put money on one of the suspects, it would probably be Aaron Kosminski, due to the witness knowing that he saw him with Catherine Eddowes but didn't want to testify against him, but also the DNA evidence as well. We haven't seen this for any other suspect, but I think it's safe to say, regrettably, that we will probably never know who Jack the Ripper was. But most importantly, let's not forget about the victims in this case, who just must have went through pure terror and pain before they met their deaths. It is a tragic way to lose your life, and I cannot imagine what that must have been like for them. If you would like me to look into a particular mystery or conspiracy, please let me know and I will look into it. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.